Thank you for tuning in to watch or to listen to this message today. Wherever you are, at home, in your car, on your computer, on your phone, we're just excited that you're spending time with us. We are on a mission here at CRB to lead people to know and love Jesus. And so if you call this place your home, I encourage you to visit our Give page on our website, where you can find a few easy ways to faithfully support God's work here at the church, financially, through online giving. At CRB, we believe that love will save the world. And the best place to do that is in the local church. So if you live in San Diego or if you're visiting the area, we just want to invite you to come join us on a weekend, come hang out with us, and be a part of the family here. Enjoy the message.
Hey everybody. Good to see you. I am so excited about this series that we're beginning this weekend called Why God. This series is going to be incredibly important for a lot of us because many of us in this room, you've had that moment before where you tell people you're a Christian, or you tell a coworker or family member that you've decided to follow Jesus. Maybe that's a recent thing for you. And you have that moment where inside you just cringe a little bit, and it's not because you're embarrassed that you're a Christian. It's not that you're embarrassed that you follow Jesus. It's just that you know, like I know, that when you tell people you're a Christian, that sentence, I'm a Christian, in our culture, it has so much baggage attached to it, which by the way, it's even worse when you're a preacher, okay? If you ever want to just end a conversation on an airplane, just float that out there. If somebody's talking to you hour 1, hour 2, and you're like, how do I shut this? Oh, I'm a preacher, by the way. That just is a nice little conversation ender. But we've all had those moments where, you've talked to somebody who, when you tell them that you're a Christian or a person of faith, they just look at you and it's that glazed over look, and you just sort of, you just cringe inside. And for those of us that have been in those moments, this is going to be a very, very important series, because in our culture, when you tell people that you're a Christian, they automatically assume that you're anti-science, that you don't think the world's that old. They automatically assume that you're, anti-gay, you're anti-human rights, you're anti-dinosaurs, you're just kind of anti-everything out there in culture. And you've sort of signed up for this, kind of Bronze Age set of beliefs. You believe in some kind of fantasy land of meaningless distinctions between who's good, who's bad, who's naughty, who's nice, who's going to heaven, who's going to go to hell. I mean, and so consequently, you don't even want to tell people because you just know the looks that you're going to get. And so on Friday, when people ask you what you're doing this weekend, you say, I'm going to go to church, to Chuck E. Cheese. That's where me and the family are going, because there's just those moments. And for those of us that have been in those conversations, why God? For some of us, this conversation is going to be incredibly important because you've experienced this on the other side of the coin, and you're a person that, for whatever particular reason, you decided to walk away from your faith once and for all. And maybe nobody even knows that. Maybe you didn't tell anybody, but you were brought up in church, your parents raised you in church, but somewhere along the way, you began to have questions. And I would be willing to bet that your tension with the Christian faith started as emotional distance. You didn't like the way certain Christians acted, or you didn't like the way certain Christians treated somebody, or you didn't like the way Christians treated you, or you saw a TV preacher and you just didn't like the way he talked, or you thought, well, if that's what a Christian is, I'm not so sure I want to be a Christian. And over time, I would be willing to bet your emotional challenges with Christianity became intellectual challenges with Christianity. And you began to discover that there was a whole school of people out there that didn't believe what you were taught to believe as a kid. And all of a sudden, that felt like a warm blanket to you because you discovered that you could walk away. There was intellectual reasons to walk away from the faith that you were brought up with. And so for many of us in this room, that's where your faith is. You would say, I'm no longer really even a person of faith. For many of us, this conversation is going to be important because, maybe you're kind of new to this whole church thing. You're just kicking the tires on the idea that there's a God or that there's Jesus. And as much as you want to believe, and you like Christians, you like the fact that Christians do a lot of good stuff in the world, but there's something in you that it feels like it would be intellectually dishonest to become a person of faith. And you're fine with Christians, helping, people and, doing the stuff that Christians do. But at the end of the day, you would say, it feels like it would betray my intellect to leave logic and reason and take some leap into a dark hole called faith. I just can't go there. And the idea that, there's a God or a devil or there's, a man that walked out of a tomb, it just is too bizarre. And for many of us in this room, that's the challenge that you have with the Christian faith. It's just intellectually dishonest for you. And for those of us that have had those questions, those concerns, why God? That's the conversation we're going to have. Why even bother? Why church? Why God in an age where it seems that there's more and more people, and many of you have friends, that have decided to walk away from their faith? Why God? So that's the conversation we're going to have for the next few weeks. Does that sound good to everybody? Okay, 4 of you. That's so encouraging. Thank you. So excited. Sport, I think I messed up my mic here. Get back in the saddle. Is it okay? It's my fault, not yours. Poor Sport's in the back. He's kind of having a Chevy Chase, Clark Griswold moment, trying to plug all the things in today. Sorry about that. I'm making your life harder. Well, before we get into that, let me try to give a little context for why we are where we are as a culture. If you go back to September 11th, 2001, obviously most of us in this room, you remember where you were on that particular day. But in a post 9/11 world, we began to live in a world that, and this is true of a culture that largely up until that moment had not been paying attention to religion. But for the first time in a really long time, all of a sudden, politics and religion, in terms of everything you saw on the news, religion was thrown on the doorstep of a culture that largely had not been paying attention. And the way that that conversation was framed, whether it was real or just perceived, was essentially like this, that it was the Christian nations versus the Islamic nations, that it was Christianity versus Islam. That was the religious conversation that was heating up every time you turned on CNN, every time you turned on Fox News, in terms of politics. That was just a part of the culture for a world that largely up until that moment had not been paying attention to religion at all. The way that you felt that was in a post 9/11 world, you all of a sudden began to learn words like Taliban. Before 9/11, you would have had no idea what that meant. Was that a cough medicine? Is that some kind of, itch cream? What is a Taliban? But all of a sudden, we lived in a world where phrases or terms like that became normal. The world began to have religious conversations. Well, the reason I tell you that is to tell you this, that in the wake of that, 2003, 2004, there was a surge in books and YouTube videos that were uploaded that came out that were scathing critiques, not just of Christianity, but of religion as a whole. And many of these books, in hindsight, they got labeled the new atheist perspectives. And certainly atheism was not a new concept, but the way that it was being framed in articulate, passionate ways certainly was new for American society. And essentially, the tone or the tenor of those books and that literature and those videos was essentially this, that religion in the 21st century world, in a post-scientific world, it makes no sense. In a world that's post-enlightenment, it's time to let go once and for all of these Bronze Age fairy tales. It's time just to let go of it. After all, look at the television. Look at how much damage it's causing to still hold on to the fabricated idea that there's a God or that there's gods out there somewhere. It's time to let go of it. And these books became wildly popular. Many of these authors, some of you remember some of these books, some of you are anything like me, you read these books. There was Richard Dawkins wrote a book called The God Delusion. Christopher Hitchens was another. He wrote a book that was called God Is Not Great. Sam Harris, Letter to a Christian Nation. Dennis Dennett was one of these authors. They sold millions and millions of copies. In a post 9/11 world, they dominated the New York Times bestsellers list. The authors of these books went on late night talk shows. They became incredible celebrities all throughout our culture. And now, for the first time, if you were skeptical of religion or you were skeptical of faith, there was a soft landing place. There was a group of people that gave passionate, intellectual, articulate reasons for why you should walk away from your faith. And I wouldn't argue so much that these books created a surge in atheism. I would argue that they created a surge in apathy and religious apathy. In other words, if you can't possibly know that there's a God, then why would you even bother? Why God? And many of us in this room, I certainly understand you did not read those books, but you felt the effect of those books that were out there. Many of you, the way that you experienced this was you had a surge in friends that began to say things like, well, I'm a spiritual person, but I'm not a religious person. Have you heard that before? Of course. Many of you in this room, it was with your kids, your son, your daughter, that you raised in church, but all of a sudden they were being brought up in a world where the cultural default position was to not go to church or not, embrace the idea of the existence of God. And all of a sudden you felt that maybe generationally there was a tension there where we now live in a world where I would argue it's not so much an atheistic society, but a culture where people are very apathetic to the idea of there being a God. In fact, the culture that we live in, for the first time in American history, 1 out of every 4 people in America, 320 million Americans, claim no religious affiliation at all. There's just an apathy that's out there. If you can't possibly know that there's a God, then why in the world would you believe in God? And so that's the conversation we're going to have for the next few weeks. Does that sound good? Anybody else at that point? Okay. Okay, finally, I can start. John chapter 6. If you have a Bible, we are going to look at a couple passages of scripture together. John chapter 6 is where we're going to begin. And I get it. It sounds kind of weird to read, a passage of scripture after that. But here's the reason why this is important. Because in the Bible, in the world of Jesus, when Jesus would teach and make the claims that he made, that he was divine, when Jesus made the claims that he did, when he did the miracles that he did, and that's obviously according to the scriptures, when he did the things that he did, there is evidence again and again in the New Testament that there are people that, just like in our cultural context, they were not on board with Jesus. And there is evidence again and again in the scriptures, we're going to look at one story in particular, where people that had followed Jesus, just like many of your friends, decided they did not want to follow Jesus any longer. John chapter 6 is where this story is. John chapter 6, we're going to start in verse 66. It might sound strange to be in John 6:66, but we're going to do it together. I didn't make it up, okay? It's just the best place to begin. And essentially what's happening at this point, the teachings of Jesus are becoming increasingly difficult, and people, they signed up for the miracles. And here they are, they're at a moment where they're beginning to go, wait a minute, what is he saying? Wait a minute, where is this all going? And they began to walk away. And in a moment of vulnerability, Jesus has a very good question for the disciples, and he has a very good question for us as well. He says this, this is John, "From this time, many of his disciples, the disciples of Jesus, turned back and no longer followed him." Maybe the way we'd say it in our culture is those darn millennials. There was a slew of people that had been brought up, or they've been walking with Jesus for a while, and they just began to turn away and say, we are not on board any longer. And Jesus asks a profound question in a moment of vulnerability. I think he has the same question for you and the same question for me. He says this to the 12, "You don't want to leave too, do you? You don't want to walk away as well, do you?" In other words, Jesus says, look, I see a lot of your friends, a lot of your coworkers, a lot of people that you're kind of interacting with, family members, they think you're crazy for still having faith and still following. You don't want to walk away as well, do you? And he begins to sort of open it up for an honest conversation with his disciples in that moment, which we're trying to do over the next few weeks. And Peter, one of the disciples, asked a very clarifying question, which for any of us in this room, whether for emotional reasons or intellectual reasons, you have doubted your faith, or you sit on the fence, or you're not quite sure that you can sign up for this whole Jesus thing, Peter asks an incredibly clarifying question that I think is still very relevant for us in the modern 21st century world. Here's what Peter says in verse 68. He answers Jesus when he says, "Do you want to walk away as well?" And he says this, "Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life." Simon Peter answered him, "Lord, to whom shall we go? You and you alone have the words of eternal life. To whom shall we go?" In other words, we may not like everything that you're saying, Jesus. We may not like everything that your followers are doing. But to walk away from you, we would just have to go into the arms of someone else. And so we may not like it, but you're still the best option that we have. To whom shall we go? And for anyone who's on the fence, for anyone who's ever struggled with doubt, for anyone who's ever in a moment of crisis or in a moment of clarity, you just thought, I cannot be a Christian any longer. This is a profound, clarifying question. To whom shall we go? In fact, let's just say that question together on the count of three. To whom shall we go? 1, 2, 3. To whom shall we go? Which in those moments when you're not sure you can hang on to faith any longer, in those moments when your wife is excited about faith, but something on you inside of you has died on the inside, in those moments, here's the question Peter asked, to whom shall we go? In other words, if you walk away from Jesus or you reject the claims of Jesus, you just end up accepting the claims of somebody or something else. That essentially what Peter is saying to Jesus is, look, we may not like all the things that you're saying and teaching, but we have to have faith in something. And he understands what we often forget in the modern world. If we walk away from Jesus or if we reject Jesus, it's not that we just sort of end up being, culture or mainstream. It's not that we're off the hook in terms of having to have faith. Faith is not a Christian idea or Christian concept. All of us in this room, faith is a human thing, and all people end up having to have faith in something. And if you reject the claims of Jesus, it just means that you put your faith or you have to accept the claims of somebody else. To whom shall we go? Maybe another way to say it is this, as Peter understands this, that if you leave the Christian faith, and you can think of it this way, like the Christian faith is a fishbowl. It often feels that way, doesn't it? Many of us that you grew up in church, it feels like, there's Christian music, there's Christian movies, there's even Christian breath mints. I don't know if you knew that or not. It's true. You can look it up. Testaments is what they're called. Isn't that nice? You can have sacred breath. It's so good. And you can just keep going with that. There's all kinds of there's Christian everything. If you decide at some point, I don't want to be a Christian fish anymore, often the way that we frame the discussion is, I'm just gonna go be in culture. I'm just gonna be a normal person. I'm off the hook in terms of having faith. But the way that Peter is framing the discussion, it's true in our world as well. If you leave the Christian faith, if you walk away from this faith community or you reject it, you will just end up being a part of a different faith community. We all end up having faith in something. And Peter's just saying, look, to whom shall we go? If we leave you, if we don't want to be like a Jesus, Dory or Nemo anymore, we're going to become something. We have to become something. We're just going to enter into a different kind of faith community. To whom shall we go? If you leave the Christian faith, if you reject the Christian faith, you'll just end up being a part of a different faith community. It may not believe in God. It may not have the same, conversations about heaven, hell, morality, but it will have its own doctrines. It will make its own claims of faith. You can't possibly know that there's a God is a claim of faith. Nobody's off the hook in terms of having faith. And the reason this is so important is because in our culture, when I meet people that walk away from faith or reject the Christian faith, very seldom, and this is true in America, this isn't true in other parts of the world, but people walk away and they don't enter into one of the other major religions of the world. They don't become, Buddhist or Hindu. Oftentimes, very seldom have I heard that. 1 or 2 times in my years of being a pastor. What typically you hear, and you bump into this with your friends and coworkers or maybe your kids, is when people reject the Christian faith or they walk away from the Christian faith, in their mind, well, I'm just now a part of culture. I'm off the hook in terms of having faith. Maybe the way they word it, or maybe the way that you've worded it is, I'm now a person of reason or logic. I'm not a person of faith. And in our culture, the way that sociologists would word that is that you're now a secular person. And I know we're not real big on labeling people, and I don't like to label people, but for the sake of simplicity, that just means you're now a part of secular society. You're now a secular person. You hear that term occasionally, typically around Christmas time, where Christians want to say Merry Christmas, and the secular people, Happy Holiday. And oftentimes we forget that culture and the way that secular society operates, it has its own doctrines, it has its own set of beliefs and moral values. It's a faith community all to its own. It's just a different kind of faith community. And you don't get off the hook in terms of having faith. And the reason this is so important, because when you bump into these conversations at work or with family, often the way the conversation gets framed is, well, you're one of those people of faith, and I'm a person of reason. You're a person of faith. I'm a person of logic and reason. And you've made a blind leap into a dark hole and a set of Bronze Age beliefs that you can't possibly know or prove. And I'm a person of logic and reason. But here's the reality. All of us are people of faith. And every single one of us in this room, whether you're a Christian or not, we end up using a combination of faith and reason to make decisions about things beyond our five senses. All of us have to use a combination of faith and reason to navigate our choices about the things that we can't see and the things that are invisible. We all end up making faith claims, whether you're a Christian or whether you're just, I'm a part of culture now. I'm sort of off the hook and having faith. We're never off the hook in terms of having faith. We all end up using faith and reason to make choices about this idea of faith. If you keep drilling down on that, in our culture, one of the doctrines or one of the faith statements that often gets proclaimed in our culture is, if you can't prove it, it doesn't exist. You've heard that before. In fact, many of the questions that came in last week on the Why God app, or many of the questions that you submitted at Easter, one of the questions that came up again and again is, if you can't prove something, how do you know it exists? If you can't prove there's a God, then why in the world would you even believe in God? You bump into that. I bump into that all the time. And even that sentence, if you can't prove it, it doesn't exist, that's a statement of faith. Because here's the problem with that sentence. If you can't prove it, it doesn't exist, you can't even prove that sentence is true. And saying, if you can't prove it, it doesn't exist, that's an assertion. It's a statement of faith. It's not a criteria through which we should evaluate the claims of Christianity or any religion for that matter. It's just an assertion. It's just a statement. It's a scientific statement. It applies to scientific claims. If I say to you, well, water, it reaches a boiling point at this temperature, it freezes at this temperature. Well, you could say, prove it. And we could, get out the microscopes, or we could, heat up some water. We could prove particular scientific claims. But Christianity does not take place in the realms of provability. Christianity takes place in the realm of two things primarily: historical claims and moral values. Christianity takes place in those realms: historical claims and moral values. Historical claims and moral values. And as hard as you try, or as hard as I try, none of us in this room could prove a historical claim. We believe historical claims. We believe George Washington was the first president. We believe that Julius Caesar was killed on the Ides of March, depending on how far back you want to go, to Genghis Khan. We believe certain things that are historical claims, but you can't prove those historical claims. The same is true for moral values. We all in this room, every single one of us in this room, you believe, whether you're Christian or not, in moral values, but you can't prove them. You believe that you shouldn't steal. You believe that you shouldn't maybe cheat on your husband, cheat on your wife. You believe in certain moral values, but those things don't take place in the realm of provability. It's an assertion that people make. If you can't prove it, it doesn't exist. But it's not a criteria or a lens through which Christianity even claims that it should be evaluated through. It doesn't take place in the realm of provability. And furthermore, if you keep drilling down on that, all of us in this room end up living our lives, whether you're Christian or not, based on things that we can't prove. All of us, I would imagine, would agree, you should not exploit people. You shouldn't take advantage of people. You shouldn't hurt people for your own gain. We all would probably agree or believe that. Although we cannot prove it, all of us, whether you're Christian or not, end up living our lives based in ideas and claims or things that we cannot prove. It's a part of life. At the same time, if you keep going in that, it doesn't make sense to say to a Christian or a person that you would say, well, it's a person of faith. I'm not a person of faith. It doesn't make sense to say, well, you have to prove your faith or what you believe, but I don't have to prove what I believe. That question of provability then would have to apply to both faith communities. We're all people of faith. To whom shall I go? If you reject the claims of faith, it's not because of reason. It's just because you enter into a different kind of faith community. Now, the reason these are so important, and these sort of conversations are important, because these are the conversations behind the conversations. These are the conversations when people roll their eyes or people look at you like you're crazy for being a Christian or believing that a man rose from the dead. These are the conversations behind those conversations. And at the end of the day, when you boil it down, and if I'm sitting in a coffee shop and the two of us are just having a conversation, you said, okay, that's all fine and good, but why are you a Christian? Here's the reason why. One of the reasons why. Because I don't have enough faith to doubt the claims of the Bible. I just don't have enough faith in me. There's not enough faith in my heart or head to doubt the claims that Christianity makes. Maybe another way to say it is this: I don't have enough faith to doubt my faith. I certainly have questions. I certainly have doubts. In fact, if I'm honest with you, it would scare you if you knew how many doubts I have about the existence of God. I have moments where I get hung up on the unexplainable aspects of the Christian faith. It happens all the time. In years of working with high school students, anytime I would go to the funeral of a high school student, there was something in me, just like there's been moments in you, where you go, how in the world would a good God possibly allow this to take place? There are so many aspects of the Christian faith that are unexplainable. Anytime I meet someone who's been diagnosed with an illness, cancer, whatever it is, there is something in me that says, how would a good God allow this to be true? It's absolutely unexplainable to me. When I look at the news and I see world leaders that gas their own people, there's something in me, just like there's something in you, that says, how could a good God allow for that to take place? There are a lot of aspects of the Christian faith, for me, for anybody, are completely unexplainable. And when I focus on the unexplainable, my doubt begins to ramp up. My faith gets shaky when I live in the realm of the unexplainable. But it's in those moments, when I'm focused on the unexplainable, when I'm going, God, how in the world? It's in those moments, and this is my prayer for you, and this is my prayer for me. In those moments, I begin to say, God, will you shift my focus away from the unexplainable to the undeniable? Because there is a lot about God that is unexplainable, but when you boil it down and you put all the information on the table, there's a lot about God that is absolutely undeniable. And when I focus my eyes and attention on the undeniable realities of the Christian faith, my faith begins to ramp up. I begin to surge in my soul with a sense of God as a good, loving God, because there's a lot about the Christian faith, yes, that is unexplainable. But there's a lot about the Christian faith that is undeniable. You know what's undeniable? It's undeniable that there's a creation. When I look up at the sunset, when I look out in this room and there's eyeballs looking back at me and there's people that can talk to each other and reason through problems, when I think through creation and the design behind creation and the beauty behind creation, it's undeniable to me that there is a creator. And I know for many of us in this room, you would say, whoa, I can't get on board with that. And here's, sort of for me, why that's so undeniable. Because the best that science can do in our culture and our post-technology, post-scientific culture, the best that science can do is to say that something came from nothing. I wish I could believe that that's true, but I just don't have enough faith when I look out and I look up to believe that that's true. It takes too much faith. I just don't have enough faith. To me, it's undeniable. There's a creation that has a design that's attached to it. You know what else is undeniable? That there was a man named Jesus who lived. He was a Nazarite sage. He claimed to be divine. There is no doubt, any historian you talk to, any archaeologist you talk to, it is verified. There was a man named Jesus that lived, and he was crucified on a Roman cross by the Roman authorities on the side of a highway. It's what we talked about at Easter. It's undeniable. In fact, what's completely mind-blowing to me is that we know more about the historical Jesus than we know about any ancient figure that ever lived. And there was an entire government that was trying to prevent you and me from even knowing his name. And his followers, he had a group of followers that saw him crucified, and when they saw him crucified, they all scattered and went back to their jobs. But a short time later, within the week, within the month, they began to proclaim, although they couldn't explain it, and I can't explain it, that they saw something. That they saw a dead man walking. And they couldn't put words on it. They didn't know how to explain it. They were just telling people, we saw him crucified and here he is walking and talking. We saw him crucified and now we see him again. We can't explain it, but we cannot deny it. And here we are 2,000 years later. And that group of people that denied God, that just sort of walked away after they saw him crucified, they got together and they began to travel and share the word that there was a resurrection that took place, that an event had taken place. And all of those people that proclaimed that, the 12 disciples, ended up being killed for proclaiming that they saw Jesus after he died. They all ended up being killed for that. What would it take for you to die for something that you knew was a lie? It's undeniable that somebody saw something. There's a lot that's unexplainable, but there's a lot that's undeniable. You know what else is undeniable? That Jesus stood before the Roman government, handcuffed, and he said to the leaders of the Roman government, my kingdom is not of this world, and your kingdom will eventually fizzle out, but my kingdom will endure. My kingdom will go on. And he was crucified on a Roman cross. And 313 years later, I get weepy when I think about this. The emperor of Rome, the very regime and empire that crucified Jesus of Nazareth, the emperor of Rome in the year 313, Constantine, became a Christian. And his first act as emperor was to outlaw and ban the crucifixion, crosses once and for all. And the claims of Jesus that his kingdom would endure. Here we are talking about Jesus. And 2,000 years later, nobody mentions Caesar. Nobody mentions the empire that he was talking about. It's undeniable that his kingdom has gone on into this world. It's absolutely undeniable. You know what else is undeniable? When I talk to many of you in this room, you tell stories of marriages being put back together, souls that have been crushed being repaired, addictions being defeated. And the only thing you can point to, the only name you can attribute it to, is that you met Jesus and he changed you from the inside out. And it's undeniable. You know what else is undeniable? You go to any corner of the globe for the last 2,000 years, and you will meet people in various countries, in various dialects, in different languages, telling the same story that you tell. That from the inside out, they were transformed by Jesus. It's absolutely undeniable. Yes, there's a lot about the Christian faith that is unexplainable. But if you push through the unexplainable, you will find yourself face to face with the undeniable. That Jesus claimed to be the Son of God, that somebody saw something, that there is an undeniable truth that sits at the center of it all. I know Christianity is tough. I know oftentimes many of us in this room, you think about packing your bags and walking away, but to whom shall you go? And there's a lot that you would have to walk away from. And you don't get off the hook in terms of having faith. You would just put your faith in something else. To whom shall we go? In a couple weeks, we got so many questions online last week at Easter that we decided to do something. We're going to call it Doubt Night. I think it's pretty self-explanatory. But Doubt Night is going to be May 3rd at 6:30 at Brothers Provisions. And if you have questions, if you have a sense that you want to check out of your faith, that you're done, we would encourage you to come to Doubt Night. We have limited space. If you are you're a Christian, you're somebody that goes, you know what, I know where I stand with God. I don't really have a lot of questions. Would you do us a huge favor? Would you allow there to be space at Brothers Provisions? We're going to have a live stream of the event that's going to be hosted here at the church, and we would love for you to come there. But unless you have a friend that you're going to come to Brothers Provisions with, we would love just to make space there for people that have questions. And it's going to be me and Mark Strauss, many of you know Mark Strauss, on stools, just answering questions for an hour and a half. And so we would love to make a forum for you. It's going to be unscripted to ask any question that you have. Sound good to everybody? Grab a stack of these on your way out, and make sure these get into the hands of friends and coworkers. That'd be awesome. Let's pray together. God, we thank you. Yes, there's a lot that's unexplainable, but there's a lot that's undeniable. And God, I just ask through the power of your Spirit, would you point us to the undeniable? For those that are doubting, I just pray, maybe somebody who's on the fence, God, to whom shall he go? To whom shall she go? For a college student who's thinking of walking away because everybody in their dorm is walking away. To whom shall they go? We have to have faith somewhere. And God, yes, you've allowed yourself to be unexplainable, but you have made yourself known in a way that is undeniable. And I just pray you'd focus our attention, our faith in that direction. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.